The land stretched endlessly, like a tired sheet of parchment baked under the sun for centuries. It was the kind of place where the horizon was so far away you could almost convince yourself it wasn't there at all. Just a mirage that kept shifting as you walked toward it. Elias Calloway stood on his porch that morning, one boot planted firmly on the weather-worn step, the other resting on a plank whose nails had long since rusted through. His eyes swept across the cracked earth that was supposed to be his livelihood. It wasn't land anymore. Not really, more like a graveyard for crops and dreams alike. The ranch had once been a modest but thriving spread, passed down from his father, who had passed it down from his father before him. The Calloways had been cattle people for generations, men with dust on their boots and sunburn on their necks, women who could wring a chicken's neck in the morning and bake bread by noon. Elias had been raised on stories about abundance, herds so large they looked like rivers of brown and white flowing across the plains, barns so full of hay you could almost smell spring in the middle of winter. But those days were long gone. The drought had crept in slowly, like an unwelcome guest who refuses to leave. The first year, the grass grew thinner, patchier, the cattle looked leaner, and some of the calves didn't survive. The second year, the rains all but forgot the region, and the ground began to split under the sun's relentless weight. By the third year, the Calloway herd was little more than a memory. Elias had sold what he could to buy grain, but even grain was worth more than gold in times like these. By the fourth year, the barn, once a lively place with the smell of hay and the lowing of cattle, stood mostly empty, its wooden beams groaning with age. Money had become a ghost in Elias's life. There were no buyers for a ranch with nothing left to give, and the bank wasn't interested in loaning anything to a man who had no collateral beyond a few rusted tools, a sagging barn, and a stubborn streak that wouldn't let him walk away. Every day, he counted his remaining possessions as if naming them might make them multiply. A worn leather hat, its brim curled from years of sun, a rifle with a stiff rust-bitten lever that had once belonged to his grandfather, 3 patched shirts, 2 pairs of trousers, and 1 pair of boots with soles so thin he could feel the ground. Beneath them, the loneliness was a heavier burden than the poverty. There was no one to talk to but the wind, and the wind didn't care much for conversation. His nearest neighbor was 12 miles away, and even if Elias had the strength to ride that far, he wouldn't have much to offer in exchange for a visit. His days had begun to blend together: wake up, feed what little remained of the livestock, check the fences, mend whatever was broken, and everything was always breaking. Then sit on the porch at sunset watching the colors bleed out of the sky. It was during one of those sunsets, the air dry enough to crack his lips, that he first heard the rumor. A traveler passing through, some wiry old man in a dust-coated coat, had stopped by to trade for a drink of water. Between sips, the stranger mentioned a woman in a settlement 3 days' ride north. She was offering herself in marriage, not for love or land, but for livestock, specifically 3 healthy goats. Elias had laughed when he heard it, thinking it a strange kind of jest, but the old man had been serious, leaning closer to say, "She's strong, they say. Can work harder than 2 men. Folks call her Mara. Don't know much else, but I reckon she's got her reasons." For the rest of the evening, Elias couldn't shake the thought. 3 goats. That was the price of a wife. It was absurd, and yet it wasn't. Goats could mean milk, cheese, maybe even a small profit at the market. A wife could mean help someone to share the endless work, to keep the loneliness at bay. He thought of his empty barn, of the way the roof sagged in, places where he couldn't reach alone. He thought of how his dinners had dwindled to hard bread and whatever he could trap or shoot. A woman who could work harder than 2 men sounded less like a luxury and more like a lifeline. That night, he sat by the fire, staring into the embers, turning the idea over and over in his mind. He didn't know what she looked like, or what her past was, or even if the rumor was true. But the idea of it, the possibility of saving his ranch, of having another pair of hands, was like a spark in the dark. The goats, of course, would be a loss. They were among the last living creatures he owned, aside from a few chickens. But if 3 goats could buy him, not just a wife, but a partner in survival, maybe it was worth it. The decision didn't come easily. He'd been burned before by trusting too quickly. Years ago, a neighbor had convinced him to trade half his winter hay in exchange for a sure-thing investment in a cattle auction that never happened. He'd gone hungry that winter, learning a bitter lesson about deals that seemed too good to be true. But there was something about this, about the desperation on both sides, that made it feel different. This wasn't about greed or swindling. It was about survival. By the time the fire had burned down to glowing coals, Elias knew he'd made up his mind. He'd take the risk. If the rumor turned out to be false, he'd only have lost time and perhaps a little pride. But if it was true, if Mara was real and willing, then maybe, just maybe, this would be the turning point he'd been waiting for. The 3 goats would be the currency, and the gamble would be his future. The next morning, he rose before dawn. The air was cold, the kind of cold that made his breath curl in front of his face like ghost smoke. He saddled his old mule, packed what little food he had, 2 rounds of bread, a slab of cured meat, and a flask of water, and loaded the goats into a crude wooden pen he'd rigged onto a sled. As the sun broke over the horizon, he turned north. The goats bleating in protest, the mules' hooves crunching over frost-hard dirt. The road ahead was long and uncertain. But for the first time in years, Elias felt the stirrings of purpose in his chest. He didn't know what Mara looked like, or if she'd be glad to see him, or if they'd get along at all. But he knew one thing: the ranch couldn't survive another year as it was. Something had to change. And if that change came in the form of a woman willing to trade her life for 3 goats, well, so be it. Sometimes, he thought, survival demands a kind of madness. And so he rode into the brittle dawn, chasing a rumor that might save his life or ruin it forever. The journey north was not a straight road, but a winding, stubborn path that seemed determined to test Elias Calloway's resolve. 3 days. The old traveler had said, but travelers liked to talk in half-truths, and Elias knew that 3 days in these parts could just as easily mean 5 if the weather turned or the land decided to throw obstacles in a man's way. The first morning passed quietly enough. The mule plodding, along with the steady rhythm of an old soldier, its ears twitching occasionally at the goats' bleats behind them. Elias had chosen his 3 best, a weathered old nanny with a calm temperament, and 2 younger does, strong-boned and milk-rich. They were the last vestige of value his ranch had left, and every time the sled hit a rut in the dirt and the goats stumbled, his gut clenched. It wasn't just the thought of losing them, it was the thought that if they died en route, the whole journey would be meaningless. By midday, the sun had shed its morning gentleness and turned into the pitiless overseer Elias knew so well. He removed his hat and wiped his forehead, watching heat shimmer in the distance. The air was bone-dry, the kind that sucked the moisture from your tongue before you even thought about water. He rationed his sips carefully, tilting the flask just enough to wet his mouth, never enough to quench the thirst entirely. Out here, water was the real gold, and you didn't spend gold without thinking. That night, he made camp near a dry creek bed, the cracked mud forming strange patterns like veins across the earth. He gathered what sparse kindling he could find, mostly brittle weeds and splinters from a fallen fence post, and coaxed a small fire to life. The goats huddled in their pen, chewing lazily, their eyes reflecting the firelight. Elias chewed on a strip of cured meat and a corner of bread, staring at the flames as if they could tell him whether he was a fool or a visionary. He thought about the woman Mara. In his mind, she had no clear face, just a vague silhouette against the glow of a hearth. Would she be young, old, plain, beautiful? None of it mattered much, not really. Beauty wouldn't mend a fence or milk a goat. Still, the human mind has a way of filling in blanks, and Elias found himself picturing her with strong shoulders, a quick mind, and eyes that could read the weather in the clouds. He imagined her voice low and practical, the kind that could calm animals and children alike. It was dangerous to imagine too much. Expectations were a kind of debt you paid in disappointment. But on a long road with only goats for company, the mind wandered where it pleased. On the second day, the land began to change. The flat stretches gave way to low rolling hills, their slopes dotted with stubborn shrubs and the occasional twisted mesquite tree. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of dust and something else faint, but sharp, like rain far away. Elias's heart quickened. Rain would be a blessing for the land, though perhaps not for the road ahead. A sudden downpour could turn these dirt tracks into mud slicks that swallowed hooves and wheels alike. He pushed on, the mule's breath growing heavier, the goats' bleats sharper. By midday, clouds had begun to gather on the horizon, stacking like gray mountains in the sky. The light dimmed, the air grew heavy, and Elias knew the rain was coming faster than he'd hoped. He urged the mule on, searching for a place to camp that would offer some shelter. A shallow ravine presented itself, a risky choice if the rain turned to flash flood, but better than being exposed on the open plain. He got the goats settled, the sled anchored, and the fire lit just as the first drops began to fall. They were big drops, heavy, splattering against the dirt like thrown stones. Within minutes, the air was thick with the smell of wet earth, a smell so rich it was almost intoxicating after years of drought. Elias tilted his head back, letting the rain run over his face, feeling it trace the lines of dust on his skin. The land was drinking, and so was he, but with rain came cold. And soon he was pulling his coat tight and stoking the fire higher. He fed the goats from a small sack of grain, knowing it was a luxury he could hardly afford, but unwilling to risk them going hungry. He ate sparingly himself, more bread and meat, washing it down with water he collected from the runoff pooling in a flat stone. Out here, you learned to take from the land when it gave. The third morning dawned misty and pale, the world wrapped in a damp quiet. The road was soft under the mule's hooves, and Elias had to walk more than ride, pulling the sled over slick patches where the wheels wanted to sink. Every muscle in his body ached, but the thought of turning back never entered his mind. There was nothing to go back to, only the ranch, silent and hollow, waiting for either salvation or the final collapse. By late afternoon, he crested a hill and saw smoke in the distance. It wasn't the thin scattered smoke of campfires. This was thicker, rising in steady columns, the sign of a settlement. His heart beat faster. This had to be the place the traveler spoke of. He pressed on, the landscape slowly shifting from wild scrub to tilled earth. The first signs of planted fields in a long time. The settlement was small, no more than a dozen sturdy buildings clustered around a wide, packed dirt square. Chickens darted between wagon wheels, and children ran barefoot across the street, their laughter mingling with the creak of leather harnesses and the occasional bark of a dog. Elias felt eyes on him as he entered, the mule's slow pace drawing out the moment. Strangers always drew attention in places like this, and a man leading 3 fine goats was bound to spark curiosity. He stopped at the edge of the square, scanning the faces. Some looked openly, others glanced from under the brims of their hats. A woman, at a well-paused mid-pull on the rope, studying him with the calm, assessing gaze of someone used to weighing worth in a single glance. Elias tipped his hat but kept moving, searching for he didn't even know what, a sign, a name, a face that might belong to the woman he'd come all this way to find. It was then he noticed her standing a little apart from the others, near the steps of a weathered boarding house. She was tall, with a frame built for work, not decoration. Her hair was the deep brown of fresh-turned soil, braided back from her face, and her hands rested on her hips in a way that said she was no stranger to hard labor. Her eyes, even from a distance, seemed to catch and hold his steady. Unreadable. The old traveler's words echoed in his head. She's strong, can work harder than 2 men. Folks call her Mara. Elias took a breath, feeling the weight of the journey settle into his bones. This was the end of the road, or the beginning of something entirely different. Elias Calloway had not expected the moment of introduction to feel like standing at the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath his boots. After days of hard travel, his body was sore, his clothes dust-streaked, and his beard unkempt. He smelled faintly of smoke, rain, and livestock, not exactly the scent of romance, but there was no undoing the miles he had just put behind him. Now, he found himself staring across the wide, packed dirt square at the woman the traveler had called Mara, feeling as if every step toward her would be a step deeper into some binding fate. The sounds of the small settlement pressed in on him. From all sides, the rhythmic creak of a windmill turning slowly in the light breeze, the metallic clang of a hammer from the blacksmith's shop, the sing-song shouts of 2 children chasing each other with sticks. A chicken scuttled across his path, clucking irritably, and the mule flicked its ears as if equally annoyed by the interruption. The goats trailed behind him in a loose cluster, their hooves clicking against the hard earth, their bleats soft but insistent, as though they too sensed the importance of this meeting. Mara did not move from her place near the boarding house steps. She watched him approach, her stance relaxed but not welcoming, her eyes tracking him like a wary ranch dog watching a stranger cross its territory. Elias, in turn, took his time closing the distance. Each step gave him another second to read her. The sun-weathered skin, the strong hands that bore the faint lines of calluses, the way she stood with her weight evenly balanced, not the posture of someone timid or hesitant, but of someone who knew her own ground and intended to keep it. He tipped his hat when he was close enough for politeness to matter. "Afternoon," he said, his voice carrying the rasp of travel dust. Her gaze flicked to the goats and then back to his face. "Afternoon," she replied, her tone neither warm nor cold, simply even, as if she were reserving judgment until she had more to go on. The air between them was taut with a strange kind of curiosity. Elias had rehearsed a dozen opening lines on the road, some straightforward, some tinged with charm, but all of them seemed foolish now. He settled for the plain truth. "Name's Elias Calloway, been told you might be in need of kind of partnership." One of her eyebrows lifted slightly. "And who told you that, old traveler?" he said. "Passed me on the southern trail. Said you're strong as 2 men, can run a ranch with your eyes closed." She gave a short, almost imperceptible shrug. "Sounds like talk. Travelers are good at that." Elias shifted his weight, suddenly aware of the eyes watching from across the square. People were pretending to mind their own business, mending harnesses, sweeping steps, watering horses, but their ears were tuned to this conversation. Out here, gossip traveled faster than wind, and by nightfall, every word exchanged between him and Mara would be in someone else's mouth. "I didn't come here to waste your time," Elias said quietly, so only she could hear. "Or mine. I've got 3 good goats, milk-rich, strong-boned. I'm offering them in trade, not just for land, but for a life we could build together." Mara's eyes held his for a long moment. Her gaze was steady, probing, as though she were weighing more than just his words, perhaps the set of his shoulders, the grit under his fingernails, the way he didn't flinch under her scrutiny. Then she looked past him to the goats. "They any good in the winter?" she asked. "Survived last year's freeze on scrub and will," Elias replied without hesitation. "If they can make it through that, they can make it through anything." Faint twitch at the corner of her mouth suggested she was trying not to smile. She stepped down from the boarding house porch and walked toward the animals, her boots kicking up small puffs of dust. The goats shifted uneasily as she approached, their nostrils flaring, but they didn't shy away. She crouched beside the oldest nanny, running a practiced hand down its back, checking muscle and bone with the same deliberate touch Elias used himself. "Solid," she murmured, almost to herself. She straightened and looked back at him. "3 goats for me, is that what you're saying?" "It's what I've got to offer," he said, "and I can work hard. I know land, I know animals. I know how to make something out of nothing if the ground's willing." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "And if it isn't," Elias didn't hesitate, "then I make it willing." The square had grown quieter, the hammer at the blacksmith's having fallen silent. The children now perched at the edge of a rain barrel to watch. Even the windmill seemed to turn more slowly, as though the whole town were holding its breath. Mara crossed her arms and studied him for another long moment, the silence stretching out so far Elias could hear the blood in his own ears. Finally, she said, "All right, but we do this my way." Elias felt something loosen in his chest, not relief exactly, but the sense of a gate opening after a long wait. "Fair enough." Her gaze flicked once more to the goats, then to him. "You'll stay in the barn. Tonight, we'll talk more in the morning." And with that, she turned and walked toward the edge of the square, without another word, leaving Elias standing in the dust, the goats shifting restlessly at his side, and a dozen curious eyes tracking his every move. The barn loomed at the edge of Mara's property like a sentinel, its weathered boards silvered by years of wind and sun. Even from a distance, Elias could see the story in its bones, the sag in the middle of the roof that spoke of storms endured, the mismatched planks patching holes where time had bitten away, the rust-dark hinges on the wide double doors that had groaned open and shut through countless seasons. The air between him and that barn felt heavier than the rest of the evening, carrying with it the smell of hay, earth, and the faint tang of old manure, since Elias had lived with most of his life. Yet tonight they seemed almost ceremonial, as if this night was about more than just shelter. Mara had said little after agreeing to his offer. The sun was already tilting low, spilling amber light across the open square, and by the time Elias led the goats through the thin wire gate, the shadows had begun to pool like ink at the barn's base. A lone crow called from the fence post, its voice harsh in the stillness, then flapped away toward the darkening tree line. The goats moved ahead of him willingly, their hooves drumming softly on the packed earth. Elias felt the rope pull gently. In his hand, a familiar, grounding weight. Behind him, the murmurs of the townsfolk faded as the distance grew. He didn't look back. Their curiosity was a wind he'd learned to walk against long ago. As he approached the barn doors, Mara stepped aside without a word, one hand resting on the latch. She gestured with a tilt of her head. Inside, he led the goats through, the doors yawning open, with a long creak that echoed in the hollow air. Inside, the light was dim and warm, streaked by narrow shafts of gold spilling through the gaps in the siding. Dust motes swirled lazily in those beams, catching the last of the sun like flecks of molten copper. The scent here was richer, layered, old hay, animal musk, dry wood, the perfume of a life lived close to the land. The interior was simple but well kept. Fresh straw lay scattered in one corner, a wooden trough leaned against the wall, and a ladder rose to the loft above. Elias's eyes moved over the space, noting the small repairs, the new nails, the rehung gate on one stall, the quiet evidence of care. Mara followed him inside, her boots whispering against the straw. "They'll stay in this pen," she said, indicating the corner stall. "Water's in the bucket there, feed's in the bin." Elias nodded, guiding the goats into the stall and slipping the looped rope from their necks. The animals sniffed at their new surroundings, then began to nose through the straw. Unconcerned. When he straightened, Mara was watching him. Her face was unreadable, her eyes steady. The barn seemed to hold its breath. "You'll bed down here," she said, her voice calm, but carrying an edge that made it clear this was not a suggestion. "In the morning, we'll talk about what comes next." Elias looked around again, the loft above, the stretch of open floor beside the goat's pen, the smell of the place settling into his lungs like an old memory. He felt the faintest thread of anticipation twist inside him, though for what exactly he couldn't name. "That's fine," he said. Mara gave a single, curt nod, then turned toward the doors. She paused with one hand on the latch, glancing back over her shoulder. "Don't go wandering. This land can turn on you if you don't know it." And with that, she stepped outside, the doors swinging shut behind her. Elias stood in the half-light, the muffled sounds of the goats rustling nearby. Somewhere, beyond the walls, the wind moved through the dry grass with a sound like a whisper. He lowered himself onto the straw, stretching his legs, his back leaning against the wooden wall. It was not the first time he'd slept in a barn, but something about this one, about the way Mara had looked at him, the unspoken weight in her warning, made the shadows seem deeper. The night outside more alive. The barn settled around him, wood creaking softly in the cooling air. Above, in the loft, something shifted, a faint scrape, almost like a footstep, but when Elias looked up, the space was still. He told himself it was the settling of boards, the scurry of a mouse, yet he couldn't shake the sense that this night was the threshold of something neither he nor Mara yet understood, and that whatever waited beyond it was already drawing closer. The first few hours in the barn passed slowly, almost stubbornly, as if the night itself were reluctant to move forward. Elias sat with his back against the stall's wooden frame, watching the goats settle into their new pen. Their soft chewing was a rhythmic, grounding sound, a reminder of the bargain that had brought him here, 3 goats. A marriage spoken of more in whispers than in celebration. And now a place on Mara's land that felt less like a welcome and more like a test. The last smear of daylight drained from the narrow slats in the barn walls, leaving the interior in a velvet darkness broken only by a thin line of moonlight spilling beneath the doors. Dust still hung in the air, and he could smell the lingering warmth of the sun in the hay beneath him. The boards against his back were cool though, and their rough edges pressed into his shoulders in a way that made him shift often. Mara hadn't returned since she'd left him there. He'd expected at least the sound of her boots crossing the yard, or the swing of the barn doors announcing her presence. But the silence outside was unbroken, except for the wind, which had picked up as night deepened. It slipped through the gaps in the barns, siding with a sound like a low whistle, and now and then a draft curled around his ankles. It was a silence Elias had known before, the kind that came on certain nights in the open country, when the world seemed to pull in on itself, every living thing holding still. Out there in the dark, the land stretched for miles, and yet he felt as if the edges had drawn close, hemming him in. Somewhere in that quiet, his thoughts began to turn over what exactly he had agreed to. He hadn't been a stranger to odd arrangements. In his life, the ranching world was built on them, but marrying for livestock, even 3 healthy goats, was something else entirely. It wasn't shame that pressed at him, but the sense that there was more to Mara's reasons than she'd said. She was not a woman who struck bargains carelessly. His mind replayed their brief courtship, if it could even be called that. Few exchanges at the market, her cool gaze measuring him in a way that made him feel both appraised and challenged. She'd spoken little, always in short sentences, as though words were a currency she had no interest in spending freely. And yet she had agreed to his offer without much hesitation. Provided the terms were met, the goats, his work on her land, and, though she hadn't put it into words, an understanding that he would follow her rules, the goats shifted in their pen, one of them stamping a hoof softly, and the sound pulled Elias from his thoughts. He rubbed the back of his neck and glanced toward the loft again. That faint movement he'd heard earlier still nagged at him. The barn had the stillness of a place that held more than it showed, as if there were layers to it he hadn't yet uncovered. He pushed himself to his feet, the straw crunching beneath his boots. For a long moment, he stood listening to the goats, to the wind, to the distant bark of a coyote. Then, moving slowly, he stepped toward the ladder that led to the loft. The rungs were smooth with age, and the wood creaked under his weight. When he reached the top, he paused, letting his eyes adjust. The loft smelled of old hay, sharp and dry. Moonlight filtered through a small gap in the wall, laying a pale rectangle on the floor. The space was mostly empty, except for a few bales. Stacked neatly to one side, he crouched, running his hand over the rough twine binding one of them, and felt the lingering warmth it had trapped from the day. Nothing unusual. And yet, as he straightened, he caught the faintest trace of something, a scent that didn't belong here. It was faint, elusive, a mix of wood smoke and something floral, maybe lavender. It reminded him of the scarf Mara had worn at the market once, the one she'd tugged tighter around her neck when the wind had cut across the square. The scent seemed to cling to the air here, as if she'd been in this loft recently. He glanced around again, wondering if she had been watching him earlier from up here, measuring how he moved in her space. Shaking off the thought, Elias descended the ladder, the creak of each rung loud in the barn's hush. Back on the ground, he crossed to the stall and sat again. The goats had settled, their sides rising and falling in slow rhythm. Time slipped by, marked only by the shifting of shadows and the distant sounds of the night. Elias was used to work that left him bone-tired by evening, but tonight, his muscles held a restless energy. He stretched his legs, leaned back, and let his gaze drift toward the barn doors. That thin line of moonlight had widened, and through it he could see the pale outline of the yard. Then a sound, soft, deliberate, not the wind, not the goats, footsteps. They moved slowly across the packed earth outside, then paused just beyond the doors. Elias's heartbeat ticked up, though he kept his body still. A shadow broke the sliver of moonlight, and for a moment he thought Mara had returned. But the silence stretched too long for that. Whoever or whatever was out there seemed to be listening. The latch gave a quiet rattle. Elias's hand went to the small knife at his belt, his fingers curling around the worn handle. He didn't rise, not yet. The doors shivered once, then stilled, and then the footsteps began again, this time moving away. He let out a slow breath, releasing the knife. The wind carried the sound of the retreating steps into nothingness. Somewhere deep inside, Elias knew this night was only the beginning, and that the barn, the land, and Mara herself were holding secrets he would have to earn, or survive, to uncover. The first thing Elias noticed was not the light, it was the silence. It wasn't the ordinary quiet of a sleeping ranch, where the night's stillness is broken now and then by the rustle of wind or the distant cry of an owl. No, this was a heavy, unnatural silence, the kind that seems to press against the eardrums, smothering every other sound. Even the goats had gone still, their steady chewing halted, their ears flicking in the direction of the barn doors as if they sensed something coming long before he could, and then he saw it at first. It was just a faint glow spilling through the gaps in the barn's old boards, pale, flickering, and unsteady, as though someone outside was carrying a lantern and shielding it with their hand. But as the light moved, it wasn't accompanied by footsteps, not even the faintest scrape of boots on the packed earth. Elias's body went rigid. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He'd been in enough barns in his life to know the way light bends and shifts through their walls. But this was different. The glow pulsed in irregular beats, sometimes fading until it almost vanished, then swelling again in a strange rhythm, almost like breathing. His hand instinctively found the hilt of his knife again, though the gesture felt absurdly small against the size of the unease curling in his gut. The goats shifted nervously. One let out a sharp, questioning bleat, but the sound seemed swallowed before it could properly echo. Then came the sound, so soft at first he thought he imagined it. A slow, deliberate click, not the metallic clang of a latch being thrown open, but the gentle, unmistakable sound of a key turning in a lock. His heart stuttered. The barn doors had been shut from the inside. When Mara left him here earlier, there was no reason for anyone else to have a key, unless, of course, they had always meant for this night to go very differently than he imagined. The key turned again, this time with a certainty that made Elias's skin prickle. The doors didn't swing open right away. Whoever was outside lingered there, their shadows shifting just enough to break the light in fractured patterns across the dirt floor. Elias rose slowly, his boots crunching softly in the straw. His mind was a flurry of possibilities. Mara returning in the dead of night, perhaps to test his loyalty, or someone else entirely, someone who knew he was here and meant to find him alone. Finally, the doors eased inward, the old hinges groaning under the strain. The light spilled wider, pooling across the barn floor until it reached his boots, and there she was. Mara stood framed in the moonlight, but she wasn't holding a lantern. The glow that seemed to follow her was simply the pale wash of the night sky, the silver sheen of the full moon catching in the folds of her shawl. Her expression was unreadable, part guarded, part something else. She stepped inside without a word, letting the doors fall half-closed behind her. For a moment, she simply stood there, her eyes scanning the barn, as if to reassure herself that nothing had changed since she'd left him here. Then her gaze found his. "You're still here," she said, her voice low, almost flat. Elias gave a short nod, unsure whether it was an accusation or an observation. Mara moved past him without another word, her boots barely making a sound on the packed dirt. She approached the goats, crouched and ran her hands along their flanks, with a familiarity that suggested she knew them better than most people she met. Then, straightening, she looked back at him. "You've kept them calm. That's good." The words might have been praise, but there was no warmth in them. She crossed to the far corner of the barn, where a small, weathered chest sat half buried in shadows. Elias hadn't noticed it earlier. Mara knelt and placed her hand on the lid, but didn't open it. Instead, she looked at him again, her eyes sharp. "You think you came here for goats," she said slowly. "That's what you told yourself. That's what I let you believe. But goats are never just goats. They're currency, they're bait. Sometimes they're an invitation." Elias didn't speak. He could feel the barn tightening around him, the air heavier, as though her words had weight that shifted the very walls. Mara tapped the chest lightly. "What's inside here isn't yours to know. Not yet. But if you want to stay on this land, if you want to keep those animals, you're going to have to decide whether you're willing to be part of what comes next." Her tone had changed. It was no longer guarded, but edged with something dangerous, something that hinted at consequences he couldn't yet see. Elias's throat felt dry. "And if I'm not?" Mara's eyes didn't waver. "Then you leave, tonight, with nothing, not the goats, not your pride, and certainly not the truth." The silence that followed was longer than any that had come before. It seemed to hum, the way a wire hums when it's pulled too tight. Somewhere above them, in the loft, there was a faint scuffle, like the sound of someone shifting their weight on the hay. Elias's eyes flicked upward, but Mara didn't move, didn't even glance in that direction. It was then he realized they weren't alone.